This tutorial provides a brief overview of the exception data window. The exception data window displays detailed information about each exception from an inspection. The column on the left displays all of the exceptions grouped by the accelerometer that generated the exception. Manual exceptions and notes are listed in the bottom of the column. Click on any exception in this column to get detailed information about that exception in the data grid on the right. The first section of the data grid provides summary data about the exception ID, and the date and time the exception occurred. The second section of the data grid provides details about the exception, including where the accelerometer was located, the performance standard against which the exception was generated, the performance standard threshold level against which the exception was generated, the maximum value of the acceleration during the exception, and the duration in milliseconds. The third section of the data grid provides details about the location of the exception, including the distance to the nearest milepost, the speed, latitude, longitude, heading, and altitude of the vehicle when the exception occurred, and whether or not the GPS had a valid fix when the exception occurred. Additionally, if you have an internet connection, you can click the word location and your default browser will appear with the exception location in Google Maps. The fourth section of the data grid is the Memo Section. In this section, you can view information about the exception for documentation and reporting purposes. The final section of the data grid is the Attachments section. This section contains a list of hyperlinks to documents that are associated with this exception. Click on the attachment name to open the attachment. The exception data window has 5 buttons. The Snap button will focus all 3 data windows, GPS, sensor, and exception, to that exception's time and position. The Memo button will display an editable text box for adding or modifying the memo of an exception. The Delete button allows you to delete manual exceptions and notes. Exceptions generated by the accelerometer cannot be deleted. Select a manual exception or a note and click on the Delete button. When prompted to confirm, click Yes. The Add Attachment button allows you to add an attachment to an exception. For example, during a follow-up of an exception, you may take measurements and pictures of the location of the exception. This data can be attached to the exception. Attachments are stored locally with the inspection. For example, if you select a file from the desktop as the attachment, the file is copied to the inspection directory. If you delete the file from the desktop, the inspection still has a valid copy of the attachment. To delete an attachment, click on the Delete Attachment button. This will allow you to select which attachments to delete. The attachments will only be deleted from the inspection directory. It will not delete it from the original location of the attachment. The first toolbar at the top of the rMetrix window can be used to manipulate the view of the exception data window. This toolbar toggles exception data by accelerometer. Each accelerometer is assigned a specific color. For example, clicking on the cyan icon, the color designated for accelerometer 1000, and selecting None, removes this accelerometer's exceptions from all the data windows, including the exception data window. Clicking on the cyan icon again and selecting the performance standard adds these exceptions back into the exception data window. Clicking on the yellow icon, the default color designated for manual exceptions, toggles the visibility of manual exceptions in all of the data windows, including the exception data window. Clicking on the green icon, the default color designated for notes, toggles the visibility of notes in all of the data windows, including the exception data window. The rest of the toolbars do not affect the view of the exception data window. This has been a brief overview of the exception data window. Contact us if you would like to learn more about rMetrix.